Emily Carter, your grandfather has left you the farmhouse and the surrounding property. The farmhouse?
Oh, Emily, I'm sorry.
Looks like Grandpa really did leave you the best part.
I sat there quietly, listening to them laugh at the only thing my grandfather had left me. They thought I had inherited a falling down house. They thought I had been given nothing. What they didn't know was that Grandpa had spent the last 40 years making sure they would never discover what that house was really worth.
They called him a burden, a useless old man wasting away in a broken-down farmhouse nobody wanted. His own children stopped calling, stopped visiting, stopped caring. So when he died and left everything, his land, his money, his entire estate, to the granddaughter who never left his side, and left his 3 children nothing but an old farmhouse he'd been too poor to fix for 30 years. They laughed. They mocked her at the will reading, called her pathetic for accepting a broken-down house instead of fighting for what should have been hers too. What none of them knew, what none of them could have imagined, was that the old man they'd abandoned had spent 40 years hiding something inside those walls. Something worth more than every dollar they'd ever chase in their lives. By the time they found out, it was already too late. My name is Emily Carter, and this is the story of how the man everyone gave up on taught me the one lesson his own children never learned. I was 9 years old the morning my whole world ended. It didn't happen slowly. It didn't give me time to prepare. One moment I was a little girl with a mom who braided my hair before school and a dad who sang off-key in the car, and by sunset that same day, I was an orphan. A car accident. That's all anyone ever told me. A truck, a wet road, a moment that changed everything in less time than it takes to blink. I don't remember much about the days that followed. I remember a lot of people in black. I remember someone's hand on my shoulder, steering me from room to room like I was furniture being moved. And I remember, more than anything, the silence, the terrible silence of a house that used to be loud with laughter and suddenly wasn't. What I remember most clearly, though, is the conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. I was sitting on the stairs, knees pulled to my chest, when I heard my Uncle Gregory's voice from the kitchen. I can't take her. I've got the boys, the business, it's just not realistic right now. Then Aunt Vivian, quieter, but somehow worse. I love her, I do. But a 9-year-old? At this point in my life, nobody said my name. They just talked about me like I was a problem waiting to be solved by someone else. Then I heard footsteps. Slow ones. A cane tapping against the hardwood floor. I'll take her. The kitchen went silent. That was my grandfather. Arthur Carter. 70 years old, a widower for over a decade, living alone in a farmhouse so old the porch groaned every time you stepped on it. He wasn't rich. He wasn't in good health. By anyone's math, he was the last person who should have raised a grieving 9-year-old. He didn't care about anyone's math. He walked into that hallway, knelt down in front of me, which I later learned cost him real pain in his knees, and took both of my hands in his. As long as I breathe, he said, you'll always have a home. I didn't understand, then, what kind of promise that was. I didn't understand what it would cost him to keep it. Life at the farmhouse was nothing like the life I'd known. There was no guest room waiting for me. Grandpa gave me his, and moved into the small room off the kitchen that used to be for storage. There wasn't always enough for both of us at dinner, though I didn't figure that out until years later, when I finally understood why he was always not that hungry tonight and pushed his portion onto my plate instead. He worked with his hands from sunrise most days, fixing neighbors' fences, repairing clocks, sharpening tools, coaxing vegetables out of soil that didn't want to cooperate. Some nights he came in so tired he could barely lift his fork. He never once complained in front of me. A poor heart is worse than an empty wallet, Emily, he told me one evening, when I asked why he never seemed upset about how little we had. You can always fill a wallet. A heart that's gone empty, that's a harder thing to fix. I thought he was just being wise, the way old men in movies are wise. I didn't know yet that he was teaching me how to survive what was coming. He taught me to bake bread with hands that shook slightly from age. He taught me to fish at the creek behind the property, patient even when I scared away every fish within a mile. He taught me that broken chairs could be mended instead of thrown away, a lesson I'd realize much later that applied to more than furniture. Most of all, he taught me that love doesn't announce itself. It shows up. Every single day, in small, unglamorous ways, in a shared plate of food, in a hand held through a hard night, in a promise kept quietly instead of loudly. I thought that was just how families worked. I had no idea how rare he was. Not yet. For a while, I thought the silence was normal. I thought maybe families were just quiet like that uncles and aunts called sometimes, and sometimes they didn't, and that was simply how the world worked. I was young enough not to know any better. It took me longer than it should have to notice the pattern. Every Sunday, without fail, Grandpa would finish his coffee, walk out to the porch, and sit in the same weathered chair facing the long dirt road that led to the house. He'd sit there for hours. Watching. Waiting. I asked him once, maybe 6 months after I'd moved in, what he was looking at. He smiled, that same soft, patient smile he always wore, even when something clearly hurt underneath it. Maybe today's the day one of them surprises me, he said. Nobody ever did. Not that Sunday. Not the one after. Not for months at a time. Grandpa had 3 children. My Uncle Gregory, who ran some kind of business 2 towns over and always seemed to be in the middle of a deal too important to interrupt. My Aunt Vivian, who had a big house and a bigger circle of friends and, apparently, no room left over for her own father. And my Uncle Michael, the youngest, who I mostly knew as a voice that occasionally came through the phone, always in a hurry to hang up. Weeks would pass without a single call. Then a month. Grandpa's birthday came and went 1 year with nothing, no card, no call, nothing. I watched him check the mailbox every day for a week leading up to it, and every day after, like the card might just be running late. It never came. Father's Day was worse, somehow, because it was a day built entirely around the thing he wasn't getting. I remember him getting quiet that morning, quieter than usual, busying himself with chores that didn't need doing. I was young, but I wasn't stupid. I noticed the way his shoulders sat a little lower on those days. I noticed how he'd glance at the phone sometimes like he was willing it to ring. And I noticed, this is the part that took me the longest to understand, that he never once said a bad word about any of them. Not to me. Not to anyone. They're busy people, Emily, he'd say, if I ever asked. Building their lives. That's what they're supposed to do. I wanted to argue with him. Even at 10, 11 years old, I wanted to tell him that busy people still make phone calls. That busy people still remember birthdays. But I didn't say it. I just sat next to him on the porch instead, on those long Sunday afternoons, watching the same empty road he watched. Sometimes that was enough to make him smile again. Maybe next Sunday, he'd say, patting my hand. Next Sunday came. And went. Like all the ones before it. I didn't know yet that somewhere, quietly, he'd already stopped expecting them to come. I just didn't know he'd started expecting something else instead. It was February, and the roof of the barn had been leaking for weeks. Grandpa had mentioned it a few times, the way he mentioned things he intended to fix himself instead of paying someone else to do. I'll get to it, he'd say, like the roof could wait as long as he needed it to. I came home from school that day to a silence I felt before I understood it. The kind of silence that has weight. Grandpa. Nothing. I found him beside the barn, half buried in snow, his leg bent at an angle legs aren't supposed to bend. He'd climbed up to patch the roof himself, 71 years old, on a ladder, in the cold, because he didn't want to bother anyone with something so small. I didn't scream. I wish I could tell you I did. That some instinct took over and I handled it perfectly. The truth is I just froze for a second, staring at him lying in the snow, before my body finally remembered how to move. I'm all right, he kept saying, through gritted teeth, as I got my shoulder under his arm and half dragged him toward the house. I'm all right, Emily, don't fuss. He was not all right. I called Uncle Gregory first, my hands shaking so badly I dialed the number twice. He picked up on the 4th ring, already sounding impatient. Emily, I'm actually heading into a meeting, can I? Grandpa fell. His leg, I think it's broken. I don't know what to do. There was a pause. A long one. And then, call an ambulance if it's that serious. I'll try to call later. He hung up before I could say anything else. I called Aunt Vivian next, my voice cracking on every other word. I could hear her sigh before she even spoke. Emily, sweetheart, your grandfather is always getting himself into something. I can't keep dropping everything every time. He's on the floor. He can't stand up. I'm sure he'll be fine. Elderly men are tougher than we think. A pause. Keep me posted, okay? She never called back. I called Uncle Michael last. It rang and rang and rang, and then it just stopped ringing, the way calls do when someone declines them on purpose. I was 13 years old, standing in a farmhouse kitchen with a phone in my hand and no one coming. It was Mr. Jenkins, our neighbor, a man who wasn't even blood, who came running when he heard me crying on the porch, trying to figure out how I was going to get a grown man into a car by myself. He didn't ask questions. He just picked Grandpa up like he weighed nothing, got him into the truck, and drove faster than I'd ever seen anyone drive on that road. I sat in the hospital that whole night, in a chair that wasn't built for sleeping, watching Grandpa's chest rise and fall under a blanket that was too thin. Every hour, a nurse would come in, check something, and leave. Every hour, I checked the door, half hoping, even then, that someone from our family would walk through it. No one did. Not that night. Not the next morning. Not once during the entire week he stayed there. When we finally came home, everything was different, quietly, permanently different. Grandpa needed a cane now, and even with it, walking hurt him. I learned to help him in and out of the bathtub without either of us saying much about how strange that felt, a 13-year-old steadying a grown man like he was the child. I learned to cook more than cereal and toast, because someone had to, and it clearly wasn't going to be anyone but me. I picked up a part-time job stocking shelves after school, and I never told him where the extra grocery money was coming from. I don't think he ever asked, because I don't think he wanted to know the answer. The truck broke down that spring, something in the engine Grandpa used to be able to fix himself, before his hands started shaking too much to hold a wrench steady. He called his children, one by one, and asked, as gently as I've ever heard anyone ask for anything, if they might be able to help cover the repair. Gregory said business was slow. Vivian said she'd think about it. Michael didn't call back at all. I watched my grandfather, a man who had given away his bed, skipped his own meals, and spent 30 years fixing other people's broken things without ever once being paid what he was worth, sell his father's pocket watch to a man in town so we could afford new brakes. He didn't tell me until years later. I only found out because I noticed it missing from his nightstand and asked. "Things are just things, Emily," he said, when I finally got the truth out of him. "I'd rather lose a watch than lose you to a broken-down truck on the highway." I cried that night after he went to bed. Not because of the watch. Because somewhere in that hospital room, on that cold February night, something had shifted between us that could never shift back. I had stopped being the child he was raising. I had become the person keeping him alive. And the people who were supposed to be doing that, the people whose job it was, hadn't even bothered to show up. Looking back, I think that year, the year after the fall, was when Grandpa and I stopped being just family, and became something closer to a team. Maybe he understood, in some quiet way, that I'd earned it. That a girl who sits beside a hospital bed all night doesn't need to be protected from the truth of things anymore. Or maybe he just needed someone to talk to, now that his body had started reminding him he wouldn't be around forever. Whatever the reason, that was the year he started really teaching me. Not just chores. Not just hold this and pass me that wrench. He taught me why. He showed me how to read the grain of a piece of wood before I cut it, so it wouldn't split in my hands. Everything has a direction it wants to go, he told me, running his thumb along an old fence post. Fight it, and it breaks. Work with it, and it holds for 50 years. He taught me to garden properly, not just planting seeds, but understanding soil, timing, patience. "You can't yell a tomato into growing faster, Emily," he'd say, and I'd laugh, and he'd smile, that small smile that made the corners of his eyes crinkle. He taught me to bake bread the way his own mother had taught him, kneading with the heel of his hand even when his fingers shook. Some mornings the kitchen would fill with that warm, yeasty smell, and for a few minutes it didn't matter that the truck was still making that grinding noise, or that the roof still needed patching in 3 more places. We laughed a lot that year. More than people might expect, given how little we had. I think that surprised me most, looking back, how much joy can live inside a hard life, if the right person is standing next to you in it. But there were moments, too, that I didn't understand at the time. Moments I'd only make sense of years later. Sometimes, out of nowhere, Grandpa would say something strange, something that didn't quite fit the conversation we were having. People throw away things they don't understand, Emily, he said once, apropos of nothing, while we sat shelling peas on the porch. I asked him what he meant. He just shrugged. Just something I've been thinking about. Another time, staring up at the farmhouse from the yard, he said, almost to himself, "This old house has more value than anyone realizes." I laughed, actually laughed, because to my 13-year-old eyes the house was falling apart, a porch that groaned, a roof that leaked, paint peeling off the siding in long curls. "Grandpa, I don't think anyone's going to be fighting over this place." He looked at me for a long moment. Something passed behind his eyes that I couldn't name. "You'd be surprised," he said quietly. Then he changed the subject, and I let him, the way you let old men have their strange little moments without pressing. It was around that same time that I started noticing the attic. Grandpa had always kept it locked, nothing unusual about that. Old houses have all kinds of locked doors nobody thinks twice about. But that year, I began to notice he was going up there. Often. Sometimes for an hour after dinner. Sometimes late at night, when he thought I was already asleep, I'd hear the narrow stairs creak under his weight, one slow step at a time. I asked him once what he kept up there. "Old things," he said. "Boring things. Nothing a young girl needs to worry about." I believed him. Why wouldn't I? He was Grandpa, the most honest man I'd ever known, a man who'd sold his own father's watch rather than tell a lie to get out of a hard month. I didn't yet understand that a person can be completely honest with you and still be keeping the biggest secret of their life. I just knew that some nights, when I couldn't sleep, I'd hear those stairs creak long after midnight, and in the morning, Grandpa would come down looking tired in a way that had nothing to do with his body. I never asked what kept him up there so long. I wish, now, that I had. For a long time, I thought the family simply didn't visit. It took me longer to realize that wasn't quite true. They didn't visit often. But they visited. And every single time, without exception, there was a reason attached, a reason that had nothing to do with missing him, and everything to do with needing something from him. Uncle Gregory came first that year, pulling up in a car that looked far too expensive for a man who'd claimed, more than once, that money was tight. He hugged Grandpa on the porch, loud and warm, the kind of hug that photographs well. Then, over coffee, the real reason came out. "Dad, I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. The business just needs a bridge, 6 months, maybe less, and I'll pay every cent back." Grandpa listened the way he listened to everyone, patiently, kindly, like the person in front of him mattered more than anything else in the world. Then he said, gently, that he didn't have it to give. That what little he had needed to stretch for the two of us, for the house, for whatever came next. Gregory's face changed. Just slightly. Just enough for a 13-year-old sitting quietly in the corner to notice. "You'd rather sit on this falling-apart house than help your own son," he said, standing up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. Unbelievable. He left 20 minutes after he'd arrived. He didn't hug Grandpa on the way out. Aunt Vivian came a few weeks later, and her visit followed its own version of the same pattern: warmth first, agenda second. She'd brought papers. Real estate papers, the kind with a lot of small print and highlighted signature lines. She wanted access to part of the land, she explained, for an opportunity she didn't fully explain. She needed Grandpa's signature to make it happen. "It's just sitting here, Dad. Unused. You're not even farming half of it anymore." Grandpa read through the papers slowly, the way he read everything, and then slid them back across the table. "I appreciate you thinking of me," he said. "But I'm not signing anything I don't understand. It's not complicated, it's just. Then it won't hurt to wait until I do understand it." Vivian's smile stayed exactly where it was, but something behind her eyes went cold. She called him difficult on her way out. Old-fashioned. She said it lightly, almost like a joke, but jokes like that don't feel like jokes when you're the one hearing them from your own daughter. Uncle Michael's visit was the shortest, and somehow the hardest to watch. He didn't bother with warmth at all. He came in already talking about a debt, vague about the details, specific about the number, and asked, more or less directly, if Grandpa would consider mortgaging the farmhouse to help him cover it. Grandpa said no. Michael didn't argue the way the others had. He just looked at him for a long moment, shook his head, and said quietly, "You'd rather watch me struggle than let go of a house you can barely afford to keep the lights on in." Then he left. He didn't say goodbye. I remember standing in the kitchen doorway after that one, watching Grandpa sit alone at the table, staring at nothing. I wanted to say something angry, probably, something a 13-year-old thinks will fix things. Instead I just sat down across from him. "Why do you let them talk to you like that?" I finally asked. He was quiet for a while before he answered. "Because getting angry back wouldn't teach me anything I don't already know," he said. "But watching, and staying calm, that tells me everything." I didn't understand what he meant. Not then. It was a few days later, walking past the kitchen, that I overheard Vivian on the phone with someone I never found out who, her voice pitched low like she thought no one was listening. "He's just sitting on land he doesn't even understand anymore," she said. "Old man doesn't have a clue what he actually has." I remember feeling angry on Grandpa's behalf, assuming she meant the farm, a run-down, half-used piece of land that, to my eyes, wasn't worth fighting over at all. It would be years before I understood she wasn't wrong. She just didn't understand it either. The heart trouble started small enough that we almost didn't take it seriously. A dizzy spell here. A shortness of breath climbing the porch steps that hadn't bothered him before. By the time we got him to a doctor, the word they used was failing, a heart that had simply worked too hard, for too long, for too many people who never once asked how tired it was. I remember driving home from that appointment in complete silence, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel of a car I'd only just gotten my license to drive. Grandpa sat beside me, looking out the window at fields he'd worked his whole life, and he didn't say a word until we pulled into the driveway. "Don't you dare cry over me, Emily," he said, not unkindly. "Not yet. We've still got time." We didn't have as much as either of us hoped. The hospital visits became more frequent that year. I missed school more than I should have, and never once regretted it. I called Gregory, Vivian, and Michael every single time, because some part of me still believed that this, finally, would be the thing that brought them running. Gregory came once, stayed 40 minutes, and left saying he had a flight to catch. Vivian sent flowers to the hospital room instead of coming herself. A card. No visit. Michael promised he'd drive down next weekend more times than I could count. Next weekend never once arrived. So it was just me. Again. Always. I didn't mind it, not really, not the way it might sound. There was something almost sacred about those long hospital nights, just the two of us, the machines humming quietly beside his bed. He'd tell me stories I'd never heard before about my grandmother, about his own father, about mistakes he'd made when he was young and stubborn. He talked like a man settling his accounts, one conversation at a time, making sure nothing important went unsaid. "Love isn't the things people tell you," he said one night, his voice thin but steady. "It's who's still standing there when it stops being easy. Remember that." I told him I would. I didn't fully understand yet how much weight that sentence was carrying. There was one more thing he said, near the end, that I didn't understand at all, not then. We were sitting together at home, one of his better afternoons, watching the sun start to dip behind the fields. He reached over and took my hand, his grip weaker than it used to be but still warm. "One day," he said slowly, "you'll understand why I never sold this house. No matter how many times they asked. No matter how hard things got." I assumed he meant sentiment. Memories of my grandmother. The life they'd built inside those walls together. "I know, Grandpa," I said, squeezing his hand. "It's home." He smiled at me then, a strange smile, equal parts sad and knowing, like he was looking at a much bigger picture than the one I could see. "It's more than that," he said. "But you'll see." I didn't ask what he meant. I wish, more than almost anything else from that year, that I had. He passed away 3 weeks later, in his sleep, in the house he'd refused to leave and refused to sell no matter what it cost him. I was the one who found him in the morning, and I was the one who sat with him for a long while before I called anyone at all, because some part of me needed those last few quiet minutes to just be his, before the world came in and made it about everyone else. When I finally did call the family, the response was different this time. Faster. Louder. For the first time in years, all three of them showed up within a day. I remember standing on that same porch where he used to wait every Sunday, watching 3 cars pull into the driveway at once, and thinking, with a bitterness that surprised even me, that it had taken his death to finally get them all here on the same day. I just didn't know yet how much that timing would end up mattering. The funeral was exactly as beautiful as Grandpa deserved, and exactly as hollow as I expected. Gregory gave a eulogy about the man who taught him everything he knew about hard work. Vivian cried real tears, I think, though I've never been sure what they were actually for. Michael stood in the back in a suit that probably cost more than Grandpa's truck, saying almost nothing, looking at his phone more than the casket. People I'd never seen once in 6 years came up to me afterward, squeezing my hands, telling me what a wonderful father Arthur Carter had been to his children. I nodded and thanked them and said nothing about the empty Christmases, the ignored phone calls, the Sundays he spent watching a road that stayed empty. It wasn't the place. And some small, tired part of me thought, let them have this. Let them believe whatever version of him lets them sleep at night. I sat through it all with a strange, hollow calm. I'd already done my grieving, I think, in hospital chairs, on quiet porches, in a kitchen where I learned to cook for 2 people instead of 1. What was left, by the time of the funeral, wasn't fresh grief. It was just absence. A house that would never again have the sound of his cane tapping down the hallway. The will reading happened 3 days later, in a small office downtown that smelled like old paper and coffee that had been sitting too long. The lawyer, a quiet, careful man named Mr. Whitfield who'd apparently handled Grandpa's affairs for decades, read through the document slowly, methodically, like he understood exactly how much weight every sentence carried. Gregory received a sum of money. Enough to matter, not enough to change a life. Vivian received the same. Michael, too. Modest inheritances, evenly split, the kind of thing that suggested a man who'd quietly saved more than anyone gave him credit for. Then Mr. Whitfield turned a page, and read the next line. To my granddaughter, Emily Carter, who stayed when no one else did, I leave the farmhouse and the surrounding property. Silence, for exactly 1 second. Then Gregory laughed. Not a cruel laugh, exactly, more disbelieving, like he'd misheard. That's it. The house. Vivian's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Well, at least she'll have somewhere to live, I suppose. Michael didn't even bother hiding his smirk. Guess the old man really did save the best for last, he said, and the way he said it made it very clear he meant the opposite. I sat there, still, in a wooden chair too stiff for a room like that, and I didn't defend myself. I didn't need to. Because while they saw a falling down farmhouse with a groaning porch and a roof that still leaked in 2 places, I saw the room where he taught me to bake bread. The stairs I helped him climb 1,000 times, one careful step after another. The kitchen table where he told me love isn't the things people say. I don't need anything else, I said quietly, the first thing I'd said since the reading began. I already got what mattered. Gregory rolled his eyes. Vivian sighed, the kind of sigh reserved for people she considered hopeless. Michael just shook his head and gathered his coat, already halfway to the door, already halfway back to whatever life he'd go on living without a second thought for the man who'd raised 3 children mostly alone. I moved into the farmhouse 2 weeks later. I remember standing in the doorway that first night, keys in my hand, looking at a house that everyone else had already dismissed as worthless and feeling, for the first time since he died, something close to peace. I had no idea, standing there, how much that house was about to change everything. The first few weeks in the farmhouse were quiet, in the way that only grief can make a house quiet. I didn't rush to change anything. I left Grandpa's chair exactly where it had always sat by the window. I kept his boots by the back door, still caked with dried mud from the last time he'd worn them. Some mornings I'd catch myself listening for his cane on the hallway floor before I remembered, all over again, that I wasn't going to hear it. Eventually, though, the house needed work, real work, the kind Grandpa had been putting off for years because there was never enough money and never enough time. The porch groaned dangerously under my weight now. Water stains bloomed across the ceiling in the back bedroom. So I started, slowly, room by room, doing what he'd never had the chance to finish. It was the floor in his old bedroom that stopped me cold. I'd pulled up the worn carpet to check the boards underneath. Mr. Jenkins, still the closest thing to family I had left, had warned me some might be rotted through. Most of them were fine. But one, tucked in the back corner near where his bed used to sit, gave slightly under my palm in a way the others hadn't. I knelt down and pressed harder. It shifted. Not rotted. Loose. Deliberately loose. My hands were shaking by the time I pried it up, and beneath it wasn't rot or dust or empty space, it was a small hollow, carved carefully into the floor joists, just large enough to hold a metal box. Steel. Cold under my fingers. Heavier than I expected. I sat on the bare floorboards for a long moment before I opened it, my heart doing something strange and fast in my chest. Some part of me already knew, before I even lifted the lid, that whatever was inside was going to change something. I just didn't know how much. Inside were journals, a dozen of them at least, worn leather covers softened by years of handling. Beneath those, folded maps, old and creased at the same lines so many times they'd nearly split apart. Property deeds, stacks of them, filled with names of places I didn't recognize. Legal documents, official looking, with seals and signatures and language I couldn't fully understand at 17 years old, sitting alone on my dead grandfather's bedroom floor. And on top of everything, resting where I couldn't miss it, was a sealed envelope. My name was written across the front in his handwriting. The same handwriting from every birthday card he'd ever given me, every note left on the kitchen counter reminding me to eat something before school. Emily. My hands were trembling so badly it took 2 tries to open it without tearing the letter inside. If you're reading this, it means you found it, which tells me everything I already believed about you. You stayed when it would have been easier to leave. You loved me when there was nothing left to gain from it. That's not nothing, Emily. That's everything. That's the only thing that was ever being tested. Everything in this box is yours now. Read the journals. Take your time. What you're about to learn, I couldn't tell you while I was alive, not because I didn't trust you, but because I needed you to become exactly who you already are, without knowing what was waiting for you. I'm sorry for the secret. I hope, by the end, you'll understand why I kept it. All my love, always, Grandpa. I read it 3 times before I could make my hands move again. That night, I sat on the floor of his old bedroom with a single lamp for light, and I opened the first journal. It didn't take long to realize this wasn't a diary of a lonely old man's daily routines. The entries were dated, methodical, filled with numbers and names and references to meetings I'd never known about, trips he'd taken that I'd never questioned, phone calls made from town on days he said he was running errands. Each journal was a piece of something larger. A puzzle I didn't yet have all the parts to. Not treasure, exactly. Not what I expected, whatever that even was. Something quieter than that, and somehow bigger. I stayed up until nearly 4 in the morning that first night, journal after journal, my understanding of the man who raised me slowly, carefully, coming apart and rebuilding itself into something I didn't recognize yet. By the time the sun came up, I had one question circling in my mind, over and over, refusing to let me sleep. Grandpa, what did you do? It took me nearly 2 weeks to piece it all together, reading journal after journal by lamplight, cross-referencing the deeds against the maps, calling in a favor from a lawyer in town who owed Grandpa from years back and agreed to help me understand what I was looking at. What I found didn't just surprise me. It rearranged everything I thought I knew about the man who raised me. For over 40 years, long before I was even born, Grandpa had been quietly acquiring land. Not in his own name, not in any way that would draw attention. Through small trusts, modest purchases spread out over decades, parcel by parcel, always paid for in cash he never appeared to have. A few acres here, bought from a struggling neighbor. A stretch of woodland there, picked up at auction under a name that wasn't his. Piece by piece, patiently, invisibly, he had assembled something enormous. And the farmhouse, the one everyone had laughed at, the one Gregory called worthless, the one Vivian said I'd at least have somewhere to live in, wasn't just sentimental. It was the legal centerpiece. Every trust, every deed, every parcel of land Grandpa had spent 40 years accumulating was structured around ownership of that specific property. Without the farmhouse, none of it connected. With it, the whole estate belonged to whoever held those keys. The land alone, once the lawyer ran the numbers, was worth more than either of us could really process sitting in his cramped little office that afternoon. Tens of millions, conservatively. Possibly more, depending on how certain parcels were eventually developed or sold. I sat there in stunned silence, the same question circling that had kept me awake for 2 weeks straight. Why did he hide it? Why did he let himself look poor, let himself go hungry, sell his own father's watch, wear the same coat for 15 winters when he had this the entire time? The answer was in the last journal. The one dated most recently, written in handwriting that had grown shakier with each passing year. I never wanted the money to be the thing that decided who loved me. If I'd lived like a wealthy man, I would have spent my whole life wondering, do they visit because they love me, or because they're waiting for their share? I couldn't bear not knowing. So I let them believe there was nothing to wait for. And I watched who stayed anyway. Only one person stayed, Emily. It was you. Every hospital night, every skipped meal, every Sunday on that porch, you never once asked what you'd get out of it. You just showed up. Again and again, for a man everyone else decided wasn't worth their time. The farmhouse was never the inheritance. It was the test. And you're the only one who ever passed it. I put the journal down and cried in a way I hadn't let myself since the day he died, not out of grief this time, but something closer to overwhelming, disorienting love, for a man who had engineered his own poverty for 40 years just to find out the truth about the people around him. The family found out within the month. The lawyer's office isn't exactly built for secrets, and word travels fast when tens of millions of dollars are involved. Gregory called first, his voice tight with something that wasn't quite an apology. Emily, listen, we should talk. As a family. I think there's been some kind of oversight with the will. Vivian showed up at the farmhouse in person, standing on the same porch her father used to wait on every Sunday, telling me how close she and I had always been, how certain she was that Grandpa would have wanted things split fairly between all of us. Michael didn't bother with pretense at all. He sent a lawyer instead of a phone call, a formal letter contesting the will, claiming undue influence, claiming a 17-year-old girl couldn't possibly have earned an inheritance that size honestly. They sued. All three of them, together, for the first time in years actually united about something. They lost. Grandpa, it turned out, hadn't left anything to chance. Every trust was airtight. Every document had been reviewed by lawyers he'd consulted quietly over decades, precisely so that no court in the world could undo what he'd built. The same meticulous care he'd put into raising me in secret had gone into protecting me after he was gone. The case was thrown out within months. The apologies that followed, and there were many, from all three of them, sudden and tearful and thick with regret, came too late to mean what they were trying to mean. I didn't need them anymore. I don't think I ever really had. I kept the farmhouse exactly as he left it. The chair by the window. The boots by the back door. I didn't renovate the parts that didn't need fixing, no matter how much money sat in accounts with my name on them now. Some things, I'd learned from him, are worth more broken in than brand new. In the evenings, when the light goes long and gold across the fields the way it always did, I sit on that same porch, his porch, the one where he waited so many Sundays for people who never came. I don't wait for anyone anymore. Nobody's missing from this porch. Just me, and the quiet, and 40 years of a secret finally understood. Sometimes I look out across the land, his land, our land now, and I whisper the only thing that ever needed saying. You were right, Grandpa. They never saw its value, because they never saw yours.